Welcome aboard for the webinar on climate resilient cities, and thank you very much for joining me for this webinar today. I am Divya Sharma. I work as a fellow in the Center for Research on Sustainable Urban Development and Transport Systems, Sustainable Habitat Division in TERI. I have with me today Ms. Raina Singh, who is a research associate in my team, and she will be moderating this webinar for us. The overall organization of the webinar is such that we will be having the presentation, which is about 40 minutes in duration, which I will be presenting to you. We will be taking your questions through chat online, and some of the questions will be selected for answering, which I will answer after my presentation. We have about 10 to 15 minutes of time duration for that question and answer session. We will also be submitting some poll questions to you, about 4 in number, during my presentation, to which you can answer. There will be an option given to you for you to answer, and then we will see the interesting results that come out of that poll questions after my presentation. So here I am with my presentation on climate resilient cities. We live in a world that is increasingly urbanizing. By 2030, nearly 60% of the global population is projected to be urban, with the developing world housing nearly 80% of this population. Over 90% of urban growth is occurring in developing countries, which will add an estimated 70 million new urban residents each year. By 2030, it is projected that all developing regions, including Asia and Africa, will have more people living in urban than rural areas. This growth is leading to increased pressure on resources like land, on infrastructure like water supply, and services just like transport systems. However, we also know that urban areas are increasingly assuming a leading role in contributing to the GDPs of nations. In 2007, people living in 600 cities, which comprise of 22% of the global population, generated $30 trillion of GDP. In 2025, it is projected that it will increase to about 60% of global GDP. Experts are increasingly refuting the old school of thought which says urbanization should be contained. The new school of thought says that urbanization is inevitable. It should be promoted and should be planned to reach maximum development goals. But development goals of the cities are seriously undermined by climate change impacts. Recent calamities across the world have drawn attention towards solutions and options that could address this. Building climate resilience is one such option, which offers holistic mechanisms to address climate variability and change without compromising on present development challenges. What is climate resilience in the context of cities? Resilient cities, in the light of climate change, should be able to develop plans for future development and growth, bearing in mind the climate impacts that the urban systems are likely to face. However, climate resilience is not about development in new ways or doing something different. It is about adding climate variability and change considerations in the planning and development framework to ensure long-term sustainability and preparedness to climate change. In that way, it becomes one of the main components of urban development process and not something very new that is being introduced to the system itself. If we look at the way to respond to climate change, it basically starts from reactive and moves towards the proactive action. Reactive, which is driven by actual perceived climate variability, and proactive, which is driven by climate forecasting of future scenarios, which means the climate that we will see in the coming years. We reach to this destination from reactive to proactive through various means. For example, disaster mitigation response, which comes after post-extreme events, disaster preparedness measures based on current variability of climate, climate proofing at project level, at DPR level, mainstreaming climate forecast into sectoral policies and processes, and strategic multi-stakeholder adaptation planning. These processes overall include a lot of multi-stakeholder planning and communication. The key actors in this will be ranging from households, CBOs, aid relief organizations, to private developers, insurers, development NGOs, sectoral agencies, environment, water, housing, centralized unit, some climate czar with strategic planning authority, for example, a municipal corporation's commissioner or a mayor. Why we need to plan for climate resilient cities? We need climate resilient cities because climate change will have impact on many sectors. Temperature and precipitation variability will impact agriculture and subsequently food security and livelihood. It will increase the extent and severity of vector-borne diseases as incidents of floods and waterlogging increase. Flooding will cause loss and damage to infrastructure and property in affected areas. Sea level rise will cause damage to coastal ecosystems. Increased damages from storm surges and will make coastal freshwater aquifers saline. Climate-induced disasters will have serious economic and social consequences like loss to property, infrastructure, health, forced migration to name a few. Climate change impacts will exacerbate existing development challenges like health, education, livelihood, housing, infrastructure and services, and poverty. If not accounted for, climate change will be an additional burden and greatly hamper development goals. But how are climate resilient cities different or better? Yes, they are better and different because they have the capability to reduce and manage the negative impacts of climate change, because they have planned and factored these changes in their development goals and planning by means of utilizing climate information, both past and future, to identify climate stressors typical to their cities or regions. When I say past trends, basically we look at how the climate has been in the last 30 years to 50 years time, and future climate projections using state-of-the-art climate modeling, science that is already available, which predicts climate of the future. These cities have been preparing and implementing strategies already to reduce vulnerability of population and city systems. They are adapting to change, preparing and responding to disasters, and mitigating GHG emissions. How to plan for climate resilient cities? Are there general rules to follow? There might not be general rules to follow as such, but there are key steps which might help the cities to plan to be climate resilient and maybe prepare strategies for adaptation and mitigation that gradually build their cities towards climate resilience. These steps include urban profiling, which means understanding your city in and out, the various sectors, the various demands for infrastructure and services, the population that the city is catering to, the kind of development vision that the city has. All these things taken together contribute to your information on urban profiling. Then, considering current and future climate stressors, some of the cities are already experiencing lot of floods, variability in precipitation, that is rainfall, high and low minimum and maximum temperatures already. These are the current stressors that the city is already being addressing to or want to address. There are some future climate stressors that will be as an impact of the overall climate change that is happening at a global level. So we need to identify both these stressors. What these stressors can do to the urban systems will comprise of the risks and vulnerabilities. These risks and vulnerabilities have to be understood. There are various methodologies and processes through which this can be done. Particularly, it is very important to see that local knowledge and local expertise is used to understand how the cities are being impacted by current stressors, because it will then lead to the knowledge as to how the city will be impacted by future climate stressors or by future impacts which will be more pronounced. This will finally lead to identification of particular strategies to reduce vulnerability and manage risk, which means develop resilience. But only this will not help. We will have to steer governance process. We will have to see that proper regulations are at place so that the cities, the local government can implement some of these strategies within the regulatory environment that is available to them. This will also need additional institutions or some kind of institutional arrangement to avail long-term benefits which climate resilience will provide to the city development and planning processes. Some of the adaptation strategies might not fall in the regular development process or the regular projects that are being planned. Some of the projects will be such that they will need new design to make them resilient to climate impact. Particularly for infrastructure projects, this is very much essential to inbuild design parameters that climate-proof that particular infrastructure from the vagaries of climate. This might need additional funds. So, locating finance is another important step in building climate resilience. We know that all the demands in an urban system are driven by community, the population that is living in the city, their aspirations and their quality of life that they desire for. It also includes inclusive development where the planning has to be done for the poor as well as for the middle and low income groups. Their aspirations are also to be accounted for because urban poor are the ones who are the most vulnerable to the vagaries of climate change and extreme events. Therefore, involving communities throughout this process is very, very important. While we look at these key steps, which looks general at the onset, we should also see that contextualization of these processes is an important element of urban resilience. It allows for identification of most appropriate process and means for resilience planning, considering the geotopographical, the governance, structure, the socio-economic situation, as well as the climate elements unique to that urban space. For example, the requirement of a hilly city will be very different from the requirement of a city that is built within a desert. Or the requirement of the coastal city will be very different from the city which is inland. Coming to the case studies, I have with me a few case studies. Right now we see that there is considerable momentum in cities across the world to plan for climate resilience. Supporting programs like Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, which is supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, UN Habitat Cities and Climate Change Initiative, Rockefeller Foundation's recent 100 Resilient Cities program, USAID's Climate Change Resilience Development Program. All these programs have been working towards addressing knowledge gaps with improved mechanisms to support cities to be climate resilient. The case studies that I take today for this presentation come from India, a developing country with immediate development-related pressures other than climate change. And so it is also very important for us in this webinar and also otherwise to understand as to how do we answer the question when there are a lot of pressures already on nations like India and climate change looks a distant threat. The case examples present here have been picked up from the Rockefeller Foundation's Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network initiative in India and have been organized as follows. We have one presentation which looks at what is the process adopted for preparation of climate resilience plan. This is a case study from Guwahati city, which is in the northeast part of India in the state of Assam. The another case study comes and looks at various components of a city resilience strategy. We have Gorakhpur city which has planned for its city resilience strategy and there are various components to this resilience strategy and through this case study I will explain what a city resilience strategy might look like. Then we have a typical adaptation strategy on conjunctive water management in Indore city, which again is situated in the central part of India and facing lot of problems related to water. Temperature increase has been predicted as one of the climate change impacts in this city. This case study is picked to make you understand how a typical adaptation strategy would look like. Then, as I have talked about governance already, governance and institutional mechanism, there is one case study from Gujarat state, Surat city, which has already gone a lot ahead in mainstreaming climate resilience. They already have a climate resilience strategy and they are now on to put up systems that help implement this strategy. And these systems are sustainable because they are centers that have been created within the municipal corporation itself, which is the urban local body taking care of the urban development in this city. Starting from Guwahati, Guwahati is a medium city in the state of Assam in northeast part of India. It is located on the left bank of Brahmaputra river. When we look at the major issues with this city, there were many issues related to the infrastructure and services of this city. There were issues related to lack of urban planning, a lot of unauthorized and informal settlements. The main problem with the city was that the city is located in a very ecologically important area, and so the ecology of the area had to be retained and conserved. However, this particular thing was overlooked while urban planning, land use planning of the city. The city had many public health and sanitation issues. Degradation and encroachment of wetlands and water bodies have happened in the cities because of this informal settlements coming up and poor planning of land uses. There was a sheer lack of waste disposal system in the city. Therefore, the watersheds and the natural water bodies were, all the waste was dumped into these water bodies. Lack of sewerage system had led to a lot of pollution of the groundwater. And it is really surprising that, and I want to share this with you, that in spite of the fact that the city is located at the banks of the Brahmaputra River, most of the water supply for the city is done through groundwater. And groundwater is polluted. It is not of the proper quality because of lack of sewerage system. Very unplanned and unregulated growth of the city was taking place. The city was also prone to urban flooding because of its location, which is in a bowl-shaped valley. The city has hillocks, some big hills also, which is prone to landslides. Our approach while doing this city was, and TERI was involved in preparing the city resilience strategy for Guwahati, was to look at the hazards and challenges that the city was facing in terms of urbanization and urban sprawl, in terms of what the future climate projections say about the climate that the city will see in future, about disasters and extreme events that might occur in the city, and of course past climate trends as to what the city has been experiencing earlier in terms of rainfall variability and in terms of temperature variability. This information led us to understanding the vulnerability of the city in terms of urban services and infrastructure, how these will be impacted and how these have been impacting the overall situation of climate and development, poverty and livelihood, what is the capacity of the city for emergency response, the vulnerability in terms of housing and urban planning, informal settlements and slums, ecosystem, which was a very important component of the city in itself, and the land use that they had planned. If we look at what was the overall framework that we adopted for preparing the resilience strategy, basically we looked on identification of main drivers of risk in terms of hazards, climate and non-climatic stressors and their trends. We looked at vulnerability to stressors, including trend analysis of city-specific variables. This led to identification of climate-sensitive hotspots, including vulnerable communities, urban functions and sectors. This information was then reinforced with the information on future climate projections, which we did in TERI through our climate modeling expertise by using regional models. And when we had this information, we basically did the current and future risk assessment of the city. This later led to the identification of the adaptation and resilience options to address the risk. Besides this, because we also wanted to see how the climate resilience strategy that we will be proposing would be implemented, we also looked at the existing policy and regulatory environment of the city so that we can see what gaps exist in the regulatory environment that might hinder in addressing these risks, and what are the entry points or available channels which are readily available to us to implement some of the adaptation strategies that we are proposing right away. This also included the institutional analysis as to who was doing what kind of interdepartmental communication and integration coordination was needed. So, identification of means of integrating and mainstreaming policies for risk reduction in the existing policy framework was conducted. Before I come to the result, I would just like to show you one slide on how we did the climate projections. We did past climate projections and future climate projections. As I said, the vulnerability to climate and environmental hazards was done on a GIS framework. A spatial analysis was also conducted where we looked at the city's vulnerability to floods and landslides. We looked at the vulnerability of urban infrastructure and services. We looked at vulnerability of the poor population, where they were located, where there were housing, where the slums were there. And we kind of, placed the flood map on these slum locations to see how many slum locations were inundated or waterlogged and for how many months in a year. We also looked at what was happening in terms of urban sprawl in the city. We looked at the land use and land cover maps. We made normalized difference vegetation index to see how the vegetation or ecosystem of the city was being impacted. As I had said, institutional analysis was done, which included the Town and Country Planning Act, which included the master plan of the Guwahati city. There was reports and regulations on disaster management and response plans in Guwahati. Guwahati is one of the only municipal corporations in the state of Assam, and they have a separate Guwahati Development Department being created above the Municipal Corporation of Guwahati, which is a state level entity, and it looks at the development of Guwahati city because it is also known as the gateway of Assam. It is one of the main tourist area, and most of the tourists that enter into the northeast part of India make Guwahati as one of the base. So it also experiences a lot of floating population that is coming to this city. The city, incidentally, is also one of the JNNURM city, which is a national scheme of the Government of India known as Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewal Mission, which is a reform-based scheme, and it is joined to or linked to infrastructure financing for these cities. And as one of the reforms to JNNURM, the cities that are JNNURM cities selected need to prepare their city development plan, which is a holistic plan of sector-specific requirements in terms of infrastructure and services, both social services and physical services, and it gives an account of the city's vision in future. So all these were studied as part of the institutional analysis. And finally, the resilience strategy of the city was made, which basically talks about eco-sensitive urban planning because of the location of the city, about planning of infrastructure and services considering the climate of the future, about housing because it was seen that the urban poor population was one of the most vulnerable population sector in the city because of waterlogging, floods and other natural calamities like earthquake and other problems like landslides. All these things were intricately linked to this disaster risk reduction mechanism, and which comprised the holistic resilience strategy for the city that we proposed. So this is how the overall process took place in Guwahati. Now taking up another example which talks about what are the basic components of a city resilience strategy. What does it actually look like? So we have Gorakhpur. It's a medium town city with a population of about 6 million. It is set in the foothills of the Himalayas in the TERI region at the convergence of Rapti and Rohini rivers, eastern part of India again. This diagram shows about a schematic diagram about what the strategy looks like. Basically, here also the urban scenarios were created. As I said, the key step is urban profiling. Vulnerability assessments were done. Climate scenarios were built for future as well as the past trends were looked at. And then the physical, structural and governance issues came out of this resilience strategy. The strategy talks about various sectors that need to be addressed to make the city of Gorakhpur holistically climate resilient. It includes ecosystem. It includes basic services like water supply, sewerage system and sanitation. It includes paying attention on housing, how the buildings should be designed, how the bylaws should be addressed such that they take up climate related vagaries and problems that arise, how the industries and the economy of the city should work, the transportation system, then the research and technology support needed to make this overall process a dynamic process, health, electricity and energy. So all these components together led to the preparation or the component of the city resilience strategy of Gorakhpur. While the strategy talks about all these sectors, it also talks about and pays a lot of attention on inclusion of community in the overall process through communicating with the citizens group that were present in the city already NGO groups, citizen groups, including the overall resilience building programs through schools, including students from colleges, doing a lot of education and sensitization programs at the level of the city. A lot of capacity building is inbuilt into this strategy at various levels. Capacity at the level of the common man, the capacity at the level of the government, the urban local bodies, the engineers that are working, the urban managers that are working day and night for the development of the city, and various other departments that have to work in unison, in coordination for the city's better future, for example, health. Some of the pilots were also devised, which were supported by Rockefeller Foundation, which basically showed how these strategies which are planned in the resilience strategy can be implemented. So overall, this is an evolutionary resilience strategy. It gives a lot of focus on capacity building at various levels. It targets physical and institutional actions to improve drainage, housing, health and communication systems of the city. Calls for more information on data and knowledge-focused activities to establish the evidence base required for long-term planning. So in a nutshell, this is how a resilience strategy should or would look like. If we come to zero down again to particular strategies, because in Gorakhpur there was this holistic resilience strategy which culminated into a number of adaptation strategies that the city should have taken to build its resilience. Now I am talking about one of the other ACCRN city, Indore city, which is located in the central part of India. They, in their strategy, came up with a project which talks about conjunctive water management in the city based on demand, focus and use. It was conducted and carried out with the help of Indore Municipal Corporation and selected community user group. The ACCRN partners were also very instrumental in making this happen, in making these pilot projects implemented. Some of the resident welfare association of the particular localities which were selected for this project implementation were also engaged in this. If we look at the objective, the potential outcome and benefit of this particular project was to demonstrate alternative, viable and sustainable models for cost-effective, reliable, decentralized urban water management through community involvement. Indore is a city which has a lot of water problem already. The water or the deficit is being covered through water which is brought from the river Narmada, which is far too away. It is very expensive for the city to bring this water to the residents of the city. So they had to look up some options which can help them address their recent problem or current problem of water. And also, since the climate projection said that this problem will be much more grave because of temperature increase and loss of water, they had to look on some kind of sustainable, decentralized method where they can have water for the residents of the city. So the project comprises of three key phases. One was community context analysis to understand the city's water scarcity situation at present and provide the context for developing integrated water management options and community level intervention processes. The other phase involved development of tools and methods for the assessment of the present water resource situation and future projections and technology options. The community level interventions, phase 3, involved developing tools for community mobilization and piloting user-managed integrated water systems. As part of the scaling up effort, this particular pilot project was implemented in 4 pilot communities, which included 2 low-income communities, 1 middle-income community and 1 upper-class community. And the replication effort was conducted with help of various private sector and other stakeholders which were interested in the overall program. Now when we look at this strategy, we know the process of climate resilience building. We've seen what a typical strategy might look like, what kind of sectors are addressed when we talk about climate proofing a city. We also know how one of the adaptation strategy would look like, and holistically speaking, a city might not have only one adaptation strategy. It will have to look at various sectors, it will have to look at various components, it will have to look at various adaptation strategies. It might have adaptation on water, it might have adaptation on transport, it might have adaptation on sanitation, sewerage, buildings. So all these sectors have to be addressed holistically when we are talking about climate resilient cities. And I'll move on to Surat, one of the cities in the Gujarat state, in the west side of India. how they have mainstream climate resilience. Surat is again an Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network core cities. It was one of the 3 cities which were taken up initially in India. Now the program has been scaled up to about 30 plus cities. But Surat has been a pioneering example because they have not only come up with a strategy, but the overall process was supported by the Municipal Corporation of Surat, with various departments of Surat and also the South Gujarat Chambers of Commerce and Industry, which was very instrumental in the overall process. So if we look at how this particular process can be taken up within a city with the help of various sectors, including government and non-government, Surat is the best example to see that. So what happened in Surat before this resilience strategy formulation was that the South Gujarat Chambers of Commerce and Industry initiated the process with the help of the ACCRN partners, and they were instrumental in constituting the City Advisory Committee, which was housed in the Municipal Corporation of Surat, which was again the main government agency that took the leadership and initiative to bring in climate resilience in the city and to bring it as a sustainable measure. Active involvement of Municipal Commissioner and her office and the South Gujarat Chambers of Commerce and Industry throughout the process helped not only to bring up this document which is known as Surat Climate Change Resilience Strategy, but it also helped in many sector-specific climate impact analysis reports that have been published and which led to the formation of the final strategy. After the resilience strategy was formulated and the main vulnerability or the main risk to the city was known, Urban Health and Climate Resilience Center was constituted and the Surat Climate Change Trust was constituted in the city. Now talking about Surat Climate Change Trust, it is a city-level multi-stakeholder public trust having its office at the City Engineer's office. It's formulated with the objective of addressing problems arising out of urbanization and climate change and to facilitate capacity building of Surat to address these challenges. UHCRC is established in order to provide support to the state and central level urban health support systems to incorporate climate change resilience issues. It is established within Surat Municipal Corporation's Health Department. It is first of a kind institution in the country which aims to address public health and climate change adaptation issues. In February 2013, Surat Municipal Corporation announced that it would allocate 10 million Indian rupees to UHCRC for its functioning. Now to sum up this particular webinar, we've seen that these case studies, and there are many more case studies from all around the world, but we have picked up this from this initiative because of our first-hand experience with ACCRN initiative in India. These case studies I have tried to put forth so that one can throw light on issues related to climate resilience planning in general and bring out some of the governance issues that influence the preparation of climate resilience plans and later financial allocation and implementation of the same. So in the next 3 slides, I will talk a little bit about what are the issues with governance and implementation of these resilience strategies that are coming up, because right now we do not have a very clear-cut national or state agenda on city climate resilience planning or urban climate resilience planning. If at all it has to happen, and in the cities where it has happened, climate resilience planning has happened, what were the key enablers that led to the preparation of the overall process of stakeholder consultation, city advisory committees that were formed within the overall process? What are the key enablers that led to successful preparation, planning and implementation of a city resilience strategy? And if we look at overall action, we also need to understand what are the various levels for action for climate resilience, particularly for urban areas. So if we move on to the issues of governance, basically the experiences from Indian context, and I'm sure with whatever knowledge I have, some of them are common to other countries also to the developing countries as well. One is the lack of understanding of the impact of climate change and the fact that adaptation interventions are best employed and covered at local level. There is less awareness among the local government that adaptation is synonym to their function and their development goal, and it is not something contradictory to what they are already being doing. Already pressing development pressure have a great tendency in the cities to overlook adaptation issues. Integrating adaptation at municipal level seems to be difficult to the cities because there is a perception that there will be contest for budget. Budget which is needed for infrastructure and services that are yet to be built to cater to the ever-rising demand on housing, on water supply, on sanitation, severages, transportation, roads, public transport systems that are needed by the city. There is lack of capacity within the local government even to plan and integrate climate resilient issues into the urban development processes right now. And so a lot of capacity building is needed at various levels. At present, development plans of cities do not factor climate change related factors in a targeted way. This is also because there is no mandate at the national level or a state level or even the city level to have climate change being accounted for when planning for urban development. Besides this, translation of global impact of climate change to local level, which technically is known as downscaling, has been missing. This knowledge is not readily available to the cities, and so it's difficult for cities to even understand what kind of climate they are going to face in future. To make these assessments, even for climate modeling, for doing urban profiling, for understanding vulnerability in this, a lot of data is required, which is not managed at present in the city in the format it is needed. There are a lot of gaps in the data, and our experience is such that the data is scattered all over the city with various departments. There is no one system where this data can come together and anybody can access this data. So there is a lot of problems with data, which will eventually help in planning of climate resilience and strategy. So what we need now is a robust institutional policy arena being created to be made available to support cities to plan for resilience, to have climate change impacts for future projections available to them, to have the data available to them, the modeling framework to them, the techniques and tools to do the vulnerability and risk assessment. And building, a long-term capacity building program should be done so that this capacity is built gradually and it is built in a way that it is sustainable and brought in the system of urban management in cities. Now, what would be the key enablers? Of course, policy and mandate at the national and state level, which can generate momentum and interest and motivation at the city level, where actually the implementation will take place. Integration of climate agenda with the city development agenda. Institutionalization of urban climate resilience planning, maybe creating an urban resilience cell in the municipal corporation, or setting up an office of urban resilience, a database management system, which is a dynamic system which updates so that the decision making is facilitated. Use and involvement of local expertise is very, very important in this case because a lot of local knowledge is lying there in the city. There are a lot of people in universities, local organizations that have been working in the city since decades together, and they know the city in and out, and they can help the scientists or the external partners that are coming in the city to help them plan for climate resilience. They can generate context-specific, locally driven solutions which are not only sustainable but very, very feasible in terms of finance and also in terms of sustainability. As I said earlier, capacity building and awareness generation at the grassroots level to generate momentum and facilitate action at all levels, and access to knowledge on climate variability and change. These are some of the few key enablers for bringing in climate resilience in cities. If we look at actions, although we are talking about climate resilience in cities, we know that the overall governance systems work in tandem with the state government and the national government. This is particular area where a lot of climate knowledge is coming from international organizations or international community that are working on climate modeling, that are working on climate projections. So access to information, finance and support for cities in terms of capacity building, in terms of research, innovative technologies for adaptation, mitigation and bringing in resilience is needed from the side of the international community. What the national governments can do is plan and implement for adaptation and mitigation strategies. They can put together a mechanism by virtue of their hold on the policy making processes, institutions and regulations that they can bring in that should support this kind of intervention. They can also provide incentives for climate proofing and bring in energy efficiency and use of clean energy. encourage appropriate climate responses to these incentives and policies, and develop partnerships with non-government actors which can help them implement some of these policies on ground. When we talk about local governments, basically the local government should be able to understand and assess vulnerability of the city and its components to climate impact. They should relate climate responses to the future vision of the city. Community participation, inclusive participatory process are one of the cornerstones of this overall process, because until and unless we account for the perception of the community of the requirement of the poor people, it will not reap enough benefits, and the climate vulnerability will not be reduced to the extent that it is feasible. Then the engagement with non-government actors is also very, very necessary at the city level. As we see in the examples in Gorakhpur and Guwahati and other cities, under the ACCRN initiative itself, a lot of knowledge was generated from the local stakeholder itself. So it needs a lot of engagement with the local expertise that is already available at the level of the city. And lastly, implementation, monitoring and evaluation. It has to be a dynamic process because it is something new. It needs a lot of reiteration. It needs dynamic data. So climate resilience, if it has to build, if we have to climate-proof our cities, we need to look back and go forward. So this process is an iterative process. So we need a monitoring and evaluation process also inbuilt over here.